obese black woman was sold to mountain man as punishment by step-parents. He became her everything. The Kansas Territory Sun beat down mercilessly on the Pritchard family, a state as townspeople gathered for the reading of Samuel Jackson's will. Prudence Jackson sat quietly in the corner, her substantial frame pressed into a wooden chair that creaked under her weight. At 22, she had learned to make herself invisible during important family matters. Margaret Pritchard smoothed her black mourning dress and whispered harshly to her husband Tom. Their voices carried across the room despite their attempts at discretion. Prue caught fragments of their conversation. Burden, embarrassment, financial strain. The words stung like winter wind. Town Clerk Elijah Bryant shuffled through the legal documents with visible discomfort. His eyes darted between the papers and the whispering couple. Samuel Jackson had been a respected landowner, and his death had left valuable property in question. Elijah cleared his throat and began reading the will aloud. The inheritance was substantial. Rolling acres of fertile land stretched along the river, perfect for farming or development. Samuel had worked tirelessly to build his legacy from nothing. Prue remembered her father's calloused hands and his patient teaching. He had shared knowledge with her that most fathers never taught their daughters. Margaret's face twisted with barely contained rage as the will designated Prue as the primary beneficiary. Tom's jaw clenched tight. They had expected different terms. Much different terms. After the reading, Prue retreated to the kitchen where she overheard her step-parents through the thin walls. They spoke of railroad investors and quick sales. Margaret mentioned forged signatures and Tom calculated profits. The land would bring enormous wealth to whoever controlled it. Prue's heart hammered against her ribs. Her father's legacy was in danger. She entered the parlor with determined steps. Margaret looked up with cold eyes. Prue confronted them about their illegal plans. Her voice remained steady despite her fear. Margaret's hand cracked across Prue's cheek. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Tom produced papers from his coat pocket, debt documents, bills for Prue's care and housing. The amounts were staggering and clearly fabricated. They announced their solution. Silas Cotter needed domestic help at his mountain cabin. He would take responsibility for Prue's debts in exchange for her labor. The arrangement was already finalized. Elijah processed the paperwork with trembling hands. He noted discrepancies but said nothing. His position required neutrality even when his conscience screamed otherwise. Silas Cotter entered the house like a force of nature. Weather-beaten skin and piercing eyes spoke of years in harsh wilderness. He wore buckskin and carried himself with quiet authority. Few words passed between him and the Pritchards. Money changed hands. Prue gathered her few possessions while Margaret smiled with satisfaction. The step-parents had solved two problems at once. They would claim Prue's inheritance and rid themselves of her presence. As evening shadows lengthened, Prue faced an uncertain future in the unforgiving mountains. Dawn broke gray and cold as Silas loaded supplies onto his pack mule. Prue stood beside the wagon with her single cloth bag, watching him work with efficient movements. He had said nothing to her since the transaction at the house. His silence felt heavier than the mountain air. The journey began on well-traveled roads but quickly turned to narrow trails that wound upward through dense forest. Silas rode his horse while Prue walked behind the pack mule. Her legs ached within the first hour, but she refused to complain. She had endured worse humiliations than sore feet. By midday, storm clouds gathered overhead. Silas pulled his horse to a halt and studied the sky with practiced eyes. Rain would make the mountain paths treacherous. He glanced back at Prue, who had kept pace without a single word of protest. When the first drops fell, Prue pointed to a cluster of pine trees ahead. Their thick branches would provide shelter. Silas raised an eyebrow but guided them toward her suggestion. The natural canopy blocked most of the downpour. As they waited, Prue gathered fallen pine needles and arranged them into a dry sitting area. She pulled edible berries from bushes nearby and offered some to Silas. He accepted them with surprise. Most town folk could not identify safe food in the wilderness. The rain intensified. Prue noticed Silas favoring his left shoulder as he tended the animals. She recognized the signs of old injury aggravated by damp weather. Her father had suffered similar pain from years of hard labor. Without asking permission, she collected specific leaves and bark from surrounding trees. She crushed them between two stones to release their natural oils. The makeshift poultice would ease inflammation and stiffness. Silas watched her work with growing curiosity. She moved with purpose and knowledge that contradicted her sheltered town upbringing. When she offered the remedy, he hesitated before accepting it. The relief was almost immediate. They resumed travel as the storm passed. The mountain path grew steeper and more challenging. Prue's breathing became labored, but she maintained her steady pace. Silas slowed his horse to match her rhythm without comment. Evening approached as they reached a dangerous section of trail. The path narrowed to barely 3 feet wide with steep drops on both sides. One misstep would send horse or human tumbling into the rocky ravine below. Silas dismounted and led his horse carefully across the treacherous passage. The pack mule followed with nervous steps. Prue came last, her heart pounding as loose stones skittered into the void beneath her feet. Halfway across, the mule stumbled. Its pack shifted dangerously toward the cliff edge. Prue lunged forward and grabbed the sliding bundle before it could fall. Her quick thinking saved valuable supplies and possibly the animal's life. Silas turned at the sound of commotion. He found Prue steadying the mule with calm efficiency while repositioning the pack with proper balance. Her actions showed understanding of weight distribution and animal behavior that came from experience, not luck. They made camp in a sheltered valley as darkness fell. Silas built a fire while Prue organized their supplies. She sorted items by necessity and durability. Her system created easy access to essential goods while protecting delicate materials from damage. The fire crackled between them as they shared a simple meal of dried meat and hardtack. Silas studied Prue across the flames. She ate with dignified composure despite the day's hardships. Her clothes were dusty and her face tired, but her spirit remained unbroken. Prue noticed his scrutiny and met his gaze directly. Most people looked through her or past her, as if her size made her invisible. Silas looked at her with genuine attention. The sensation felt foreign and unsettling. He asked where she had learned wilderness skills. Prue explained that her father had shared stories of his younger days. He had taught her to observe nature and understand its patterns. Knowledge was protection against an uncertain world. Silas nodded slowly. Samuel Jackson had been respected in town for his intelligence and determination. Few people knew the full story of how he had built his success from nothing. Even fewer understood the depth of wisdom he had passed to his daughter. The next morning brought clear skies and the final stretch of their journey. The trail wound through magnificent pine forests that seemed to touch the clouds. Prue had never seen such natural beauty. The mountains dwarfed human concerns and made petty cruelties seem insignificant. They climbed higher until the air grew thin and crisp. Prue's lungs burned with each breath, but the pure mountain atmosphere invigorated her spirit. She felt further from Margaret and Tom's poison with each step upward. At midday, they crested a ridge and saw Silas's cabin nestled in a protected valley below. The structure looked solid but isolated. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting recent habitation. This would be her new home, whether she chose it or not. Silas led them down the final descent toward the cabin. Prue wondered what kind of life awaited her in this remote wilderness. The unknown frightened her less than the hatred she had left behind. As they approached the cabin door, both travelers carried new questions about each other. The journey had revealed unexpected depths beneath surface assumptions. Neither would underestimate the other again. The mountain peaks stood silent witness to their arrival, keeping ancient secrets about the transformations that wilderness could work on human souls. Silas's cabin sprawled across the valley floor like a patchwork of additions built over many years. The main structure was solid log construction, but storage sheds and workspaces had been added without clear organization. Tools lay scattered across multiple locations. Food supplies were stored haphazardly in different buildings. Prue surveyed the chaotic arrangement with analytical eyes. Resources were abundant but poorly managed. Efficiency could be improved dramatically with proper systems. She kept her observations to herself as Silas showed her around the property. He assigned her basic tasks: cooking, cleaning, mending clothes. His tone suggested he expected simple compliance from domestic help. Prue nodded respectfully while mentally cataloging every inefficiency she observed. The kitchen was functional but disorganized. Cooking implements were mixed with farming tools. Dried goods were stored without protection from moisture or pests. Valuable spices sat next to cleaning supplies. The arrangement wasted time and endangered food quality. Prue began her work quietly. She cooked meals as requested, but also reorganized storage systems when Silas was away checking traps. She created logical groupings that reduced preparation time and prevented spoilage. Her changes were subtle enough to avoid immediate notice. Within days, Silas unconsciously began relying on her improved systems. He found tools exactly where logic suggested they should be. Meals appeared more quickly and tasted better. His daily routines became smoother without him understanding why. October brought the first serious snowfall. Fat flakes fell steadily for 3 days, blanketing the valley in pristine white. The beauty was breathtaking, but the isolation was complete. No travelers would reach them until spring thaw opened the mountain passes. Prue realized she was truly alone with this enigmatic man for the long winter months. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt oddly peaceful. The mountain silence was preferable to Margaret's constant criticism and Tom's hostile stares. Silas chopped firewood with methodical precision. His powerful shoulders moved in steady rhythm as the axe split seasoned logs. Prue watched him work while calculating their fuel consumption rates. At current usage, their wood supply would barely last through February. She suggested they gather more deadfall from the surrounding forest while weather still permitted. Silas paused his chopping and studied her with sharp eyes. Her recommendation showed understanding of long-term planning that surprised him. They worked together collecting fallen branches and weathered timber. Prue identified the driest wood by examining bark patterns and testing weight. Her selections burned hotter and cleaner than random gathering would have produced. Silas began following her recommendations without question. November storms arrived with devastating fury. Wind howled through the valley like a living thing. Snow piled against the cabin walls until the windows were half buried. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid within minutes of being exposed to air. They were trapped inside the cabin for weeks. The forced proximity could have created unbearable tension. Instead, both discovered the comfort of companionship with someone who appreciated competence over appearance. Prue organized their confined space for maximum efficiency. She created reading areas near windows for natural light. She arranged workspaces for indoor tasks like mending and carving. Her improvements made the small cabin feel more spacious and livable. Silas watched her transform their environment with growing admiration. Her intelligence became impossible to ignore. She solved practical problems with creative solutions that had never occurred to him despite years of mountain living. The worst storm hit in early December. Howling winds threatened to tear the roof from its supports. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to mere feet. They huddled near the fireplace while the cabin shook under nature's assault. Food supplies dwindled faster than expected. The severe weather prevented hunting or gathering supplemental provisions. Silas calculated their remaining stores with growing concern. They faced potential starvation before spring arrived. Prue asked to examine their inventory personally. She spread every remaining item across the cabin floor and studied the collection with intense concentration. Her lips moved silently as she performed complex calculations in her head. After an hour of analysis, she announced they could survive until March if they followed strict rationing schedules. She outlined daily meal portions calculated to provide adequate nutrition while stretching supplies to the maximum duration. Sela's questioned how she could perform such precise calculations without paper or writing instruments. Prue hesitated before revealing the truth about her extraordinary memory. She could recall exact quantities, measurements, and mathematical relationships with perfect accuracy. Her admission led to deeper revelations. She recited her father's business records from memory, including land surveys, property boundaries, and legal descriptions. The detail was so precise that Selas realized she possessed documentation that could challenge the Pritchards' fraudulent claims. Prue explained how her father had secretly educated her despite social expectations. Samuel Jackson understood that knowledge was the only protection he could provide his daughter in a hostile world. He had taught her mathematics, law, and business principles that most men never learned. The conversations revealed Samuel's remarkable journey from slavery to prosperity. He had built his success through intelligence, determination, and careful planning. His achievements were even more impressive considering the obstacles he had overcome. Selas shared fragments of his own past. He had not always been a mountain hermit. His previous life had included education, responsibility, and human connections that ended tragically. The wilderness had become his refuge from unbearable memories. As winter deepened around them, both recognized they had found something unexpected in each other. Mutual respect replaced initial assumptions. Their partnership was born from necessity, but grew into genuine friendship based on shared intelligence and understanding. The worst blizzard of winter struck in January with unprecedented fury. Snow fell in thick sheets that obliterated all visibility beyond the cabin walls. Wind shrieked through the valley like tortured spirits, rattling windows and testing every board in the structure. Selas paced the small cabin like a caged animal. Years of solitude had not prepared him for being truly trapped with another person for weeks. He watched Prue mending clothes by firelight, her hands steady despite the chaos outside. The storm raged for 8 days without pause. Their carefully rationed food supplies dwindled at an alarming rate. The extreme cold required more calories to maintain body heat. Prue recalculated their remaining provisions with growing concern. She spread their inventory across the floor once again. Dried beans, salted meat, flour, and preserved vegetables made a pitiful display. At current consumption, they would run out of food before February ended. Starvation was no longer a distant threat. Selas studied the meager supplies with grim acceptance. He had survived harsh winters before, but never while responsible for another person's life. Prue's welfare weighed heavily on his conscience, despite their unusual circumstances of being together. Prue closed her eyes and accessed the vast library stored in her memory. Her father had taught her about survival strategies used by travelers and traders. She recalled conversations about emergency rationing and nutritional requirements for basic human function. Her mental calculations were precise and unforgiving. She announced they could survive until mid-March if they reduced daily food intake to absolute minimums. The portions would be uncomfortably small, but sufficient to prevent death from starvation. Selas questioned how she could perform such complex mathematics without any written assistance. Prue hesitated before explaining the full extent of her extraordinary memory. She could recall entire documents, conversations, and numerical sequences with perfect accuracy. To demonstrate, she began reciting property deeds from her father's collection. Legal descriptions, boundary markers, and survey measurements flowed from her lips with mechanical precision. Each detail was exactly as written in the original documents. Selas listened with growing amazement as she quoted contract terms, payment schedules, and witness signatures. Her memory contained a complete archive of Samuel Jackson's business affairs. The information was detailed enough to reconstruct every transaction he had ever made. The implications struck both of them simultaneously. Prue possessed legal evidence that could expose Margaret and Tom's fraudulent schemes. Her memorized documents would prove the inheritance belonged to her, not the step-parents who had stolen it through forged papers. Prue continued her recitation, sharing her father's remarkable story. Samuel Jackson had been born into slavery, but gained freedom through his master's will. He had worked as a laborer while secretly learning to read and write from sympathetic teachers. Samuel's intelligence and determination had gradually built his success. He saved every penny while studying law and business practices. His land purchases were strategic investments that grew in value as the territory developed. Each decision reflected careful planning and deep understanding of economic principles. He had recognized that knowledge would be his daughter's only protection in a hostile world. Samuel taught Prue mathematics, legal concepts, and business strategies that few women ever learned. Her education was conducted in secret to avoid attracting dangerous attention. The lessons had been disguised as household activities and bedtime stories. Mathematical problems were presented as cooking measurements. Legal principles were embedded in tales of historical figures. Business concepts were explained through examples of successful traders and merchants. Silas shared his own hidden past as their conversations deepened. He had been federal Judge Silas Cotter before retreating to the mountains. His legal career had been distinguished until personal tragedy destroyed his faith in civilization's promise of justice. His Native American wife, Maria, and their 2 young children had been murdered by racist settlers while he was away on court business. The killers faced no consequences despite overwhelming evidence of their guilt. The legal system he had served with dedication had failed when his family needed protection most. Grief and rage had driven him to abandon his position and flee to the wilderness. The mountains offered solitude where he could nurse his wounds without constant reminders of his losses. He had lived as a hermit for 5 years before Prue's arrival. The revelation of his legal expertise changed everything. Judge Cotter's knowledge combined with Prue's memorized evidence would create an unbeatable case against the Pritchards. His professional reputation would lend credibility that her testimony alone might not possess. As winter storms continued battering their refuge, they developed detailed plans for reclaiming her inheritance. Silas explained courtroom procedures and evidentiary requirements. Prue organized her memorized documents into logical sequences that would build an overwhelming case. Their partnership evolved from necessity into genuine collaboration. Both had been wounded by injustice and betrayal. Working together offered hope for restoring what had been stolen from them through legal means rather than violence. February brought slightly warmer temperatures and less frequent storms. Their survival plan was working despite constant hunger and discomfort. The end of winter seemed possible if they maintained discipline and conserved their remaining resources. News from the outside world would come with the first spring travelers. Prue wondered what developments had occurred in her absence. Margaret and Tom had probably consolidated their theft by now, believing her death in the wilderness had eliminated all threats to their scheme. The thought of confronting her step-parents filled Prue with nervous energy. She would return to town as a different person than the frightened young woman they had banished. The mountains had tested her strength and revealed capabilities she had never known she possessed. Silas prepared for his own transformation from hermit back to legal advocate. The prospect terrified and energized him in equal measure. Spring arrived with sudden warmth that sent snowmelt cascading down the mountainsides in rushing torrents. The valley transformed from pristine white wilderness into vibrant green meadows dotted with wildflowers. After months of isolation, the world felt reborn and full of possibilities. The first travelers of the season appeared in early April. 2 traders on horseback picked their way carefully down the treacherous mountain trail, their pack animals laden with goods for frontier settlements. They stopped at Silas's cabin seeking shelter and information about trail conditions ahead. The news they carried hit Prue like a physical blow. Margaret and Tom Pritchard had indeed sold her father's land to railroad investors for an enormous profit. They claimed Prue had died tragically in a winter avalanche, making them her legal heirs. The entire town mourned her supposed death while celebrating the Pritchards' sudden prosperity. Railroad construction had already begun on Samuel Jackson's former property. Survey crews had marked the land for development into a major depot and supply center. The investment would generate wealth for decades, all flowing into the pockets of her fraudulent step-parents. Worse still, the traders reported that other families had suffered similar losses. The widow Martinez had lost her farm through mysterious debt documents. The Thompson brothers found themselves evicted from land they had worked for years. A pattern of fraud was emerging with the Pritchards at the center. Silas questioned the travelers about legal proceedings in town. They mentioned that town clerk Elijah Bryant had been asking unusual questions about property transfers and documentation procedures. His inquiries seemed focused on recent transactions involving the Pritchard family. After the traders departed, Prue stared at the valley that had become her sanctuary. The peaceful mountains contrasted sharply with the chaos and corruption flourishing in civilization below. Part of her wanted to remain in this untainted wilderness forever, but her father's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that justice delayed was justice denied. Samuel Jackson had fought for everything he achieved. His daughter could do no less when faced with the theft of his legacy. Silas recognized the determination building in her eyes. He had seen that same resolve in his own mirror years ago, when he still believed the legal system could deliver fairness. His faith had been shattered, but perhaps Prue's case could succeed where his family's had failed. They spent days preparing for the journey down the mountain. Prue practiced presenting her memorized evidence in clear, organized sequences. Silas coached her on courtroom procedures and the formal language required for legal proceedings. Their preparation was meticulous and thorough. The descent began on a crisp morning in late April. Both travelers were transformed from the people who had climbed these paths 8 months earlier. Prue carried herself with quiet confidence, her posture straight and her gaze direct. The mountain winter had strengthened her body and clarified her purpose. Silas wore clean clothes and had trimmed his beard to respectable length. The hermit's wild appearance was gone, replaced by the dignified bearing of his former judicial position. He moved with renewed sense of mission after years of aimless existence. The town came into view as they crested the final ridge. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sounds of human activity drifted upward on the afternoon breeze. Prue's heart hammered against her ribs as she contemplated the confrontation ahead. Their arrival created immediate sensation. Townspeople stopped their activities and stared in shock at the woman they believed had died in the wilderness. Whispered conversations spread like wildfire through the streets. Prue Jackson had returned from the grave. Margaret Pritchard was hanging laundry when she spotted the approaching figures. The basket fell from her nerveless fingers, scattering clean clothes across the muddy yard. Her face turned pale as winter snow. Tom emerged from their house and froze at the sight of his supposedly dead stepdaughter. Word of Prue's return reached Elijah Bryant within minutes. The town clerk abandoned his paperwork and hurried through the streets toward the gathering crowd. His investigation had been building toward this moment for months. The key witness he needed had finally appeared. Elijah pushed through the circle of curious onlookers surrounding Prue and Silas. His relief was visible as he confirmed her identity and well-being. He had suspected the Pritchard's story from the beginning, but lacked evidence to challenge their claims. The clerk's first words shocked everyone present. He had been secretly investigating the Pritchards for systematic fraud affecting multiple families. His careful documentation had uncovered patterns of forged signatures, falsified debts, and illegal property transfers. Prue's testimony could provide the final pieces of evidence needed for prosecution. Margaret and Tom arrived breathless from running across town. They immediately began spinning explanations for their stepdaughter's miraculous survival. Their stories contradicted each other and raised more questions than they answered. Nervous sweat beaded on Tom's forehead despite the cool evening air. Silas stepped forward and identified himself to the stunned crowd. The revelation that the notorious hermit was actually former federal judge Silas Cotter sent shockwaves through the assembled townspeople. His legal expertise would lend enormous credibility to any case he supported. Prue began reciting her father's memorized documents in a clear, steady voice. Property descriptions, purchase agreements, and witness statements flowed from her memory with mechanical precision. Each detail was exactly as recorded in the original papers that the Pritchards claimed had been destroyed. The crowd grew larger as word spread of the dramatic confrontation unfolding in the town square. People who had suffered losses to the Pritchards pressed closer to hear Prue's testimony. Hope flickered in eyes that had accepted defeat too easily. Margaret's composure cracked under the mounting pressure. She began shouting accusations and threats that only damaged her credibility further. Tom grabbed her arm and tried to silence her outbursts, but the damage was already done. The formal legal proceedings began the following morning in the town's modest courthouse. Judge Silas Cotter had resumed his official capacity with emergency authorization from the territorial government. His return to the bench after years of absence created an atmosphere of solemn authority that silenced all protests. Elijah Bryant presented his months of careful investigation with methodical precision. Document after document revealed the Pritchards' systematic fraud. Forged signatures were compared to authentic examples. Falsified debts were traced to their origins. The pattern of deception was undeniable and comprehensive. Prue took the witness stand with quiet dignity. Her physical transformation was remarkable. The frightened young woman who had been sold into exile was gone, replaced by a confident individual who commanded respect through presence alone. Her months in the mountains had forged inner strength that radiated from every gesture. She began reciting her father's business records from memory. Legal descriptions flowed with mechanical accuracy. Property boundaries were detailed down to individual survey stakes. Purchase agreements included witness names, dates, and exact monetary amounts. Her testimony was flawless and unshakable. The railroad investors sat in the gallery with growing alarm. They had paid substantial sums for property that legally belonged to the woman testifying before them. Their investment was built on fraudulent foundations that could collapse at any moment. Margaret and Tom's attorney struggled to challenge testimony that was mathematically precise and historically verifiable. Every detail Prue recited could be cross-referenced with official records that supported her claims. Their defense crumbled under the weight of overwhelming evidence. The widow Martinez stepped forward to testify about losing her farm through mysterious debt documents. The Thompson brothers described their illegal eviction from family land. 3 more families came forward with similar stories of fraud and theft. The Pritchards had victimized the entire community. Judge Cotter's verdict was swift and comprehensive. Margaret and Tom Pritchard were found guilty of fraud, forgery, and theft on multiple counts. Their ill-gotten assets were seized for restitution to victims. The original property transfers were declared null and void. Prue reclaimed her father's land along with all profits from its illegal sale. The railroad investors, impressed by her intelligence and legal acumen despite their losses, offered her a partnership in future development projects. Her business skills had been proven under the most challenging circumstances possible. The community's attitude toward Prue transformed completely. The woman they had once dismissed as a burden was revealed as a formidable intellect with extraordinary capabilities. Respect replaced pity in every interaction. Her father's legacy of excellence lived on through her achievements. Elijah Bryant requested to become her business partner, handling legal documentation for her expanding enterprises. His investigation had proven his integrity and competence. Their collaboration would ensure that future dealings remained honest and beneficial to all parties involved. The Pritchards faced financial ruin and social exile as consequences of their crimes. Their grand house was sold to pay restitution. Former friends shunned them completely. They departed town in disgrace, carrying only what could fit in a single wagon. Justice had been served without violence or revenge. Silas returned to practicing law on a part-time basis, focusing on cases involving discrimination and fraud. His legal expertise combined with renewed sense of purpose made him a formidable advocate for the powerless. His family's memory was honored through service to others facing similar injustices. 6 months later, Prue established a thriving trading post at the base of Silas's mountain. The location bridged wilderness and civilization, serving travelers, traders, and settlers seeking fair deals. Her reputation for honest business practices attracted customers from hundreds of miles away. Silas built a modest house near the trading post, maintaining his connection to the mountains while participating in civilized society. Their partnership had evolved into something deeper than friendship. Both had found healing through shared purpose and mutual respect. The trading post became a community hub where merit mattered more than appearance or background. Prue hired employees based on competence rather than social status. Her business philosophy reflected the lessons learned during her father's struggle for success against overwhelming odds. Railroad development proceeded under Prue's partnership and guidance. Her mathematical skills ensured efficient construction, while her business acumen maximized profits for all investors. The depot and supply center became a model for ethical development practices. 1 year after her return from exile, Prue stood on the porch of her successful enterprise, watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in brilliant gold. The land beneath her feet was rightfully hers, earned through courage and intelligence rather than inherited through accident of birth. Her father's dream of security and prosperity had been fulfilled beyond his wildest imagination. Samuel Jackson's investment in his daughter's education had paid dividends that would benefit generations to come. Knowledge had indeed proven to be the greatest protection he could provide. Silas joined her on the porch as evening shadows lengthened across the valley. Both had traveled impossible distances from their lowest points to find redemption and purpose. Their story proved that human worth could not be measured by appearance or circumstance alone. The mountains stood as silent witnesses to their transformation, keeping eternal watch over lives rebuilt through dignity, perseverance, and the courage to demand justice. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.